Well, welcome to the kickoff webinar in our Equitable Greenhouse Gas Reduction webinar series. The topic today, an equity-centered collaborative approach to greenhouse gas reduction for low-income and disadvantaged communities. The tagline for this webinar and every webinar in this series, building an equitable, clean energy transition through every investment, every building, every business, every project, everywhere, for everyone. I'm Tina Poole-Johnson, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for the Center for Impact Finance at University of New Hampshire. I use she, her pronouns. This webinar series is co-hosted by the Center for Impact Finance and Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. The NRDC and CIF partnership started soon after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Our conversations soon focused on how to do something practical and actionable. We decided to develop strategy guides through a sprint design lab process to inform equitable greenhouse gas reduction through traditional lending lines of business in key market sectors. Through this sprint design lab process, supported by UNH and NRDC staff and consultants, expert teams have been sharing knowledge and developing recommendations for CDFIs, green banks, and other mission lenders on how to first, integrate and normalize greenhouse gas reduction into development services, financing, and asset management. And second, coordinate and collaborate on the most impactful ways to deploy greenhouse gas reduction fund dollars to scale clean energy financing in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Each design lab has engaged a cohort of experienced lenders, developers, and thought leaders, reflective of the project development and finance ecosystem for that market sector, to develop an equitable strategy guide. Currently, there are 4 strategy guides downloadable from our website, and the remaining 2 will be posted soon. I will be putting the link in the chat. Many of you participated in the workshops or provided comments on these drafts, and we thank you very much. Over the 7 weeks of our Equitable Greenhouse Gas Reduction webinar series, we will be using these strategy guides as the starting point for conversations on how to ensure equity, collaboration, and impact in the deployment of the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. In this kickoff webinar, we will establish a framework and discuss the fundamentals that are essential for rapid, impactful, equitable deployment of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and a just transition to a clean energy economy. Then every Thursday through August 3rd, we will explore how to operationalize these fundamentals through specific traditional lending lines of business, sector by sector, starting with the small residential sector next Thursday on June 29th, and concluding with the small business sector on August 3rd. Each of the sector-focused webinars will feature an experienced lender, a community-based organization or policy advocate, and a key industry player such as a developer, installer, or technical advisor. And as I said, each conversation will be informed by the findings and the recommendations in the Equitable Strategy Guide for that sector. We're recording today's webinar, as I said, and we'll be recording the rest of the webinars in this series. So if you miss any of them, they will be available on our website, as are the strategy guides and links to the registration. I'm excited to introduce today's moderator, Sarah Doherty from NRDC, who will tell you a little bit about herself. We'll kick off this webinar and we'll introduce the rest of the panel. Sarah?
Well, thank you so much, Tina, for hosting this and being such a great partner in this work. So I'm delighted to be a part of this first webinar in the series. I know it's going to be really exciting, and this program is amazing, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. It has so much potential, but let's be honest, it's not the easiest to understand. Any day or any moment, we might get the final details in the NOFO. But to kick us off, I'm going to do just a very high-level summary of where we are, simply to set the stage for our far more important panelists. And I'll also mention our panelists are Kathy Mann from Inclusive, Sylvia Chi from Just Solutions Collective, Abby Corso from Elevate Energy, Damon Burns from Finance New Orleans. Amazing insights they're going to give. So I'm going to kind of stick to this big picture piece. I had slides they decided not to share, but I think we'll be fine anyway. I do have materials if anyone wants me to share them afterwards. But first of all, it's a $27 billion first of its kind program at APA to rapidly deploy low and zero emission technologies. It's split between $20 billion in green financing and $7 billion for state, local, and tribal governments to deploy zero emission technologies. It's a critical tool for filling gaps in access to green capital, with at least 55% of funds dedicated to projects in low income and disadvantaged communities that lack access to financing. It's designed to use an initial infusion of federal funds to mobilize, leverage, and complement additional public and private investment. Some of our speakers will be able to really highlight that. And it's built on the successful model and track record of green banks, community development financial institutions, credit unions, and other green and community-based lenders. It's intended to scale the capacity of these experienced lenders to reach even more communities and support even more projects. High level, there's a lot of details within this, but it's a proposed structure of 3 different funds: a National Clean Investment Fund of $14 billion, a Clean Communities Accelerator of $6 billion, and Solar for All $7 billion. In particular, that $14 and $6 billion of funds work a little differently, with the $14 billion for direct investment and $6 billion for indirect investments through community lenders. But both are intended to have public and private co-investment and to have revenue recycled to achieve far more impact than their $20 billion price tag. They have 40% and 100% in low income and disadvantaged communities targeted respectively, meaning of the 16 and the 6. And then Solar for All is a little different, with the funds going to state, local, or tribal governments. 100% must be located in low income or disadvantaged communities. Another key piece, this is the largest non-tax amount of money in the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year, meaning direct funds going out the door, and the largest piece focused on equity issues. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund meets and exceeds the Biden administration Justice 40 requirements. At least 55% of greenhouse gas reduction investments must be located in low income and disadvantaged communities, with the potential to reach thousands of underserved communities across the United States. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund will do more than reduce pollution by investing in and working with historically overlooked communities. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund can fund economic opportunity, build wealth, and enable community ownership of clean energy projects. And most importantly, improve lives. It's easy for us to get stuck in the details, but that's the entire point. And then briefly, why NRDC? Well, we've been working on the Green Bank model as well as with other community lenders for decades, as well as on federal legislation for about that same length of time. Additionally, NRDC has a variety of experience in different technologies, place-based work, and a growing equity center. All of those things need finance and investment. We, as an organization, simply want this funding to be impactful, especially in disadvantaged communities, just like UNH. So we are here to try to spread the word, fill gaps, bring people together, and in general, just try and help everyone succeed. We have no skin in the game of one exact solution or one exact way. And that's both the hard and the wonderful part about this program. There isn't one solution. It's quite flexible. The legislation was 3 pages, and they're getting far more detailed, but there's this fine line of how do we give enough flexibility, because you don't want to give everyone a hammer. Not every problem's a nail, but also to give enough guardrails so that it's effective and it reads the communities that need it. So to actually talk about how these wonderful organizations are doing that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists at this point to give them a chance to introduce themselves more fully and the work they're doing. And I believe we're going to start with you, Kathy.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks, Tina, for pulling this panel together in this great webinar to be part of this kickoff of this wonderful series. My name is Kathy Mann, and I'm the president and CEO of Inclusive. And Inclusive is the national network of and CDFI intermediary for community development credit unions. With 470 members around the country, we advance financial inclusion and equity in communities historically excluded from the financial system. In 2019, Inclusive established our Center for Resiliency and Clean Energy. We forged a critical and very strong partnership with the Carsey School to establish a field-wide solar and energy efficiency financing training program. Since that time, we have supported CDFI credit unions and other community-based lenders to launch and scale lending programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve health outcomes in polluted communities, reduce energy cost burden on households, and create jobs in a greening economy. I'm just going to quickly share, some stats y'all may have heard from the Department of Energy. The national average energy burden for low-income households is 3 times higher than that for non-low-income households. African-American households have an energy burden that is 43% higher than that of white households. For Native American households, it's 45% higher, and Hispanic households, it's 20% higher. As credit unions invest in climate solutions, they really are linking and finding strong synergies between the increasing access to a cleaning and greening economy and to clean energy solutions with improved financial stability. As community-owned and controlled financial institutions, credit unions see both the responsibility and the opportunity in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to make their communities greener and more resilient. They're on the front lines of climate change. Specifically, they are operating, as many of you are, in communities with some of the poorest air quality, some of the highest energy burden, and certainly those most vulnerable to climate events like the hurricanes, the floods, droughts, wildfires. So we really kind of see the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund not simply as a source of capital or an opportunity to launch new loan products. We see the fund as the opportunity to create a more equitable environmental, energy, and financial policy in this country. It is the moment that's bringing together all of the different areas that we work on into one space where we can be making sure that we're addressing equity and emissions reduction at the same time. And it really does start with financing an ecosystem to deliver energy efficiency and solar financing. In our case, it's community-based lending to retrofit housing and commercial properties to be more efficient, to offer distributed energy generation through rooftop solar, financing of electric vehicles, vehicle purchase, and increasingly now the installation of electric charging stations. So we see there's a tremendous opportunity to see this moment as one where we're bringing together private sector lenders along with the public sector to create a pool of investment in a clean energy economy that is fundamentally distributed in a more equitable way than energy policy or financial policy has in this country to date. So that's where we are.
Just small light work. You're not busy at all, as none of you are. And so we'll turn, and we're going to do, I wrote it in the side. Please go ahead and drop your questions as we go in the chat if you want, but we're also going to leave plenty of time at the end for you to ask your own individual questions and raise hands. But if there's something you want clarifying as we go, or just a place to hold it, feel free to drop it in there. So now we'll go to Sylvia Chi from Just Solutions Collective.
Hi, everyone. All right, I have slides I need to rely on. So just give me 1 second. Oops, this is not the right. I pressed the wrong button. Okay. All right. So thanks, everyone. I'm Sylvia Chi. I'm a senior policy analyst with Just Solutions Collective. And a quick intro about Just Solutions. In short, we work with BIPOC and frontline community-based organizations around the country and provide research and policy support for justice-based climate solutions and try to elevate and replicate them. And my background is in environmental law and then environmental justice policy. I practiced environmental law for several years and then moved into environmental justice and worked as the policy director for Asian Pacific Environmental Network, which is an environmental justice organization here in Oakland and the East Bay of California. So the problem we're trying to address is climate justice broadly and energy justice more specifically, which Kathy just talked about. Energy burden is a really effective way to illustrate the issue. Like she said, lots of disparities based on income and race, as well as cumulative environmental burdens. And energy burden itself is correlated with many other adverse effects. And as many of us know, probably there are some serious challenges that exist in this context. There are some longstanding federal programs that are meant to address some of these energy assistance programs that are meant to address some of these issues, but they aren't having the impact that we really want to see to advance equity. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of the main drivers is the infrastructure inequities, including housing quality, grid capacity, et cetera, that are all driven or all caused by policy decisions, which is all to say that it's just, there's a lot of complicated pieces to this problem in order that we need to address to solve it. And as we know, climate change is going to make it all more significant and have a bigger impact. And then the other problem we're trying to solve is trying to make the Inflation Reduction Act specifically be able to reach and benefit low income and environmental justice communities directly. There's a lot of great stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's also true that just the vast majority of it will not directly benefit low-income and environmental justice communities. And that's where we come to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is because it's so flexible, it can be implemented in a way that really advances equity. And what we know based on previous place-based investing, well, as we know, like what makes greenhouse gas reduction funds particularly have a lot of potential for this is that there are carve-outs in the statutory language requiring investments in low-income and disadvantaged communities. But what we know from past experience is that place-based investing is complicated in terms of trying to actually make it make the benefits reach the communities. And so just having an investment in a certain place doesn't necessarily benefit the community. You need to have specific guardrails and governance provisions to make sure that happens. So Just Solutions, we are, we're a national nonprofit. As I said, we try to support and advocate for frontline and environmental justice communities and their CBOs. In the context of the GGRF, we kind of see ourselves as an intermediary between those CBOs and both EPA and the entities that are going to receive the awards from EPA. And in terms of how we approach equity, that is basically all we do. And so we have a lot of material about that, but a great compendium that we have of our approach is this building blocks report that we put out back in 2020. So I recommend that folks look at that for a deeper dive into it. And then for Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund specifically, what we've been working on is this best practices for governance and equity pledge, where we're calling on all the applicants to the NCIF and CCIA competitions to publicly commit to robust governance structures and processes that center equity and environmental justice and provide meaningful accountability to local communities and the public. And what we're trying to do is just make sure that the environmental justice and community-based organizations are able to have decision-making power in how these funds are deployed and making sure that the communities are benefited. And we're also engaging with EPA on that as well. The best practices themselves are shown on this slide at a high level, and we go into more detail in the actual document, and I can drop the link in the chat. But in general, we're asking for prioritizing direct benefits to the communities, requiring community engagement, making sure there's accountability to the communities, and operating with transparency, and then applying robust safeguards as well. So that is a hopefully quick intro to what we've been working on, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Once again, no one's got any work cut out for them. Wonderful, such wonderful panelists. We're going to go to Abby Corso now with Elevate Energy.
Thank you, Sarah, for moderating the panel, and thank you, Tina and team, for hosting this series and for creating these amazing working papers. I am a Chief Strategy Officer at Elevate. Elevate is a 20-year-old not-for-profit organization focused on making sure clean energy and water are available to all communities. We are particularly focused in our overlooked communities and in affordable multifamily housing, which is often kind of left behind in many programs, kind of nationally. We're a Midwest-based organization, but we are working nationally on these issues. And we're coming to this conversation and with interest in the greenhouse gas reduction from a technical implementation standpoint. We are not a lender. We work in buildings, so we work with building owners and we work with residents to make sure that the buildings are upgraded for efficiency, to low operating costs, lower resident bills, and ensure that the buildings are healthier and more comfortable for residents. So highly technical, and are really interested in the nuts and bolts of how these buildings will get upgraded. I appreciate the panelists that already talked about their comments on energy burden, and we see that every day, and feel like if we can't get these buildings upgraded and reduce costs, then we are really not doing our job as an implementing organization. I just want to make a couple comments about the need, though. I mean, we are looking at over 10 million units of affordable housing nationally, and those are not just units, but they are homes and households with families. The opportunity is to reduce operating costs and reduce efficiency and greenhouse gases by 30% if we do this correctly. If we link our financing opportunities, which are unprecedented through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, with a really robust technical implementation assistance program. And that means for the buildings that need it most, we're providing wraparound services for those buildings. We're helping them with site assessments. We're helping with the contracting community. We're helping identify the right technologies for the building, and making sure that, when we leave this building, when we as implementing organizations leave this building, and I think as financing organizations leave this building, it is in better shape than when we started working in it. I really believe that there's a lot of promise in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to do this right. As Sarah mentioned, its flexibility is there, and I think our ability as a community to work together is also there, as evidenced by, I think, everybody on this call. And I would also add that in addition to kind of the work that we do, there's also a great need around workforce. It's closely connected with our work, but it's also huge opportunity to be connecting and growing our contracting community, particularly our minority contractors, you know, who know what work needs to be done in our overlooked communities, but need to be engaged, and who also need, you know, resources to be able to grow their businesses. And I'll stop there. So throw it back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
I think this is starting to give a clue to all the participants of all the different layers that already exist, all the great expertise, work, but the key is braiding it together. So we'll go now. I'm a Southerner and I'm in Atlanta, so I love going to another Southerner, to Damon Burns from the Finance New Orleans, for him to talk, and then we'll come back around for questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and just to be a part of a great panel. So much great information and people doing the work, as Sarah keeps saying. So I want to talk to you today about what we're doing in New Orleans to get prepared for IRA benefits, as well as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and many other pools of capital that are out there. And I do have a presentation that I'm going to share. So again, I'm Damon Burns, CEO of Finance New Orleans, and we are the city of New Orleans' green bank. And I'll tell you how it became a green bank in a few moments, but we really started off as the city's housing finance agency. And as the city's housing finance agency, we were created in 1978. Most of our early history focused on providing single-family home ownership products. So that's first mortgages and second mortgages or down payment assistance for first-time home buyers, low to moderate income families, and in targeted neighborhoods throughout New Orleans. So over time, before Katrina happened, we had invested over $600 million into the community, created opportunities for many first-time home buyers, and across New Orleans, different income ranges, different demographic groups. So the community felt like we added a lot of value, and we still hear about it to this day. But we ran into some trouble. Katrina happened, the Great Recession happened, the BP oil spill happened, Hurricane Ida, and then many other things in between that aren't included here, as well as the COVID pandemic. So all of these events continue to set us back. And we've really been on a path for the last 15 years or so to becoming a green bank. Because when Katrina happened, we had a $400 million portfolio, or right under 400 million. And that was mainly comprised of single family assets. And in 2020, after those series of events, our portfolio is down to 18 million. And I've been in this role for the last 7 years. And immediately my job was to come in and help rebuild the balance sheet. And just a little bit of my background, I actually started out as a public finance banker, helping finance New Orleans with some of their bond deals, working on recovery projects. So I've been at the table for a while, working with the agency before I became the leader. And I had a pretty good head start of knowing what needed to be done. So this is our story. We want to rebuild our balance sheet, but we had to rethink our strategy overall and be more considerate of what's going on around us environmentally and economically. So that means we had to expand beyond the scope of just single family housing, which is really important and still the core of what we do. But holistic community investment involves more. So the first thing we had to do in order to become the city's green bank or become this new platform for the city of New Orleans, we needed a strategy. The city already has a climate resilience plan, but that climate resilience plan did not call out specific finance strategies or financing mechanisms that could be used to bring those climate strategies to life or those climate goals to life. So we took the lead as the city's green bank to create what we call the Resilient New Orleans Finance Plan. And it's specifically a plan that addresses the mobilization of public, private, and philanthropic capital so that we can invest in physically transformative, climate resilient, and socially impactful projects. Those are our 3 high-level goals. They flow directly from the city's climate plan, and you'll see in a moment, they flow into our individual organizational strategy as well. But this plan, this resilient infrastructure plan, calls out a framework for us to invest in as collectively as the city and all of its sub-agencies, as well as individual agency. So that's built around climate action, sustainability, green economic development, as well as social equity. And then we've also identified target project and bond issue categories where we want to focus our resources. That's renewable energy, green buildings, clean transportation, water management, and nature-based solutions, and then many other subcategories in between that don't show up on the slide. We also had to rethink our individual strategy as a part of this overall city ecosystem and where we fit in. So we created 4 new high-level strategic plan goals for the next 10 years, and that's use climate resilience to physically transform New Orleans. We want to create economic and education opportunities in the process. We also want to build wealth for community reinvestment. It always gets said that government agencies don't need to make money. Well, I'm here to tell you, that's not the truth. If we're going to add value to the community, we need public wealth so that it can be leveraged by the community, or community wealth is another way to say that. And lastly, we want to grow as an agile and innovative organization. We want to set the table. Oftentimes, it's thought that government waits on the private sector to come up with the ideas, to come up with the innovations. Well, we need to be a part of that mix too. And then there are going to be cases where we actually lead the table and we're bringing private financial institutions or commercial banks that ordinarily would not focus on green finance. We're helping to bring those types of groups to the table. And we want to continue that process moving forward. Also, we created 3 new core service areas to go along with the single family investment that we've made over the years: sustainable home ownership, sustainable development, which is multifamily, and resilient infrastructure, which is very new for us, meaning financing renewable energy developments, community solar, microgrids, and other projects that fall within our Resilient New Orleans finance plan. And this is what it looks like on the ground. This is an actual snapshot of a neighborhood in mid-city New Orleans. And it has commercial buildings, it has single family buildings, and we see a sea of opportunity to help impact and physically transform our community. So that starts with the acquisition of 1 to 4 unit homes, energy efficiency retrofitting, be it a single family, multifamily, or even a commercial building. We want hurricane resistant roofing on all of our property types, green infrastructure on the streets, I should say green and blue infrastructure, as well as affordable rental housing that's needed, as well as home ownership, solar energy and battery production, as well as stormwater retrofit. And there are many other things included, but this is how we see ways to impact our community through our 3 core service areas. So we're looking to rebuild that balance sheet. We've already started moving in the right direction. You see 103 million here. That's the amount of projects that we supported since we launched our new green business model. And that's been focused around multifamily development. All of those projects are enterprise green community standards. So even at a baseline, we're trying to make sure everything we do is green and climate resilient. But we see a path to a $1 billion impact for the city of New Orleans. And we know we can do that because we created a pretty big impact with just single family. Well, now we're doing single family, multifamily, and infrastructure for a more holistic platform that the community can leverage and create this $1 billion impact. And that concludes my presentation. I appreciate everybody's time and looking forward to taking your questions. We are on the ground doing what many cities are doing right now, recalibrating themselves. Some cities want to create a new entity from scratch, and that's actually what New Orleans was considering doing. But we had an organization that had impact, had history, and had the tools that could become this evolution of green agencies or green finance authorities, or banks, however you want to term it. So we think this is going to happen in every community around the country, and we're working with other cities as well. So happy to be here and happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
I think you hit on some important points to also affordable housing, as well as leveraging all of these different institutions that are already out there. Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund definitely wants to build on that. So y'all start thinking of your questions, start raising your hand. I will start off with a few questions. Moderator's privilege to get to ask these wonderful folks. I'm going to do one that's for everybody. One that the first part's a little bit rhetorical because we know the answer, but you know, there's the whole you build it and they will come. So is money for financing alone enough? Once again, that's the kind of rhetorical part. And so we don't think that's the case. What are the non-financial barriers threatening equitable deployment of dollars and reducing greenhouse gases and improving lives? So it's kind of, is money alone, you know, you just build it, you got a lot of financing, you do it, you're trying to get up to $1 billion, Damon. What are the pieces that aren't just pure money? What are those and how do you start to address them? Let's go in reverse since you're still on my screen, Damon.
Okay, well, from our perspective, what we've learned is that of course you need the capital, but the community needs to be educated. And actually before they're educated on what climate finance or sustainability finance means, there needs to be a demand, there needs to be a use case. And I just showed you plenty of opportunities for us to have that use case because we've been through so many disasters. So the community is now coming to us, all demographic groups, all income ranges, saying, hey, you know what? I do want solar and battery storage because I can't leave my house every time a hurricane happens, or I don't want to sit in the line at the gas station waiting to fill up my jug so I can turn on my generator at the house. So the community is starting to come out and say they want these things. That's number one. Then they need to be educated on what they are, how they fit in, can they afford it, and what makes sense for their families. And then I'll say also the policies / politics need to be right, because we can have, for example, in New Orleans, we have a desire for community solar. There are many projects that are forming and developers are interested, but the policies need to be shifted a little bit in order to make the program work. And lastly, I would say it's nurturing the entire ecosystem to make sure that there's synergy and everybody's on the same page, which sounds too idealistic, but the reality is everybody needs to be on the same page to some degree. Even if there's an agreement among everything, there needs to be some consensus about what direction the city wants to go in, or it's going to be pulling in different directions. So those are some of the other elements that we look for aside from the funding needed to carry out these projects.
Abby, great points. And Abby, if you want to, and if everyone doesn't want to answer it, don't feel like you have to, but we'll go through for this one and then I'll get more personalized questions.
Thanks, Sarah. And I do feel compelled to answer the rhetorical question is no. I mean, we've had over a decade of experience that financing alone will not make these projects move. But financing is an important component for sure. But I echo Damon's point about policy. We do need inviting policies, especially in many places around community solar. And I think most importantly, though, from our standpoint, is we need to resource our communities and our community-based organizations to help with project origination. I mean, part of the problem is finding these projects. You know, the big projects, the more sophisticated, you know, developers are always going to be bringing projects forward, which is great. We need that. But if we're really going to activate this money at the local level for smaller projects, for projects that are not in the subsidy programs at HUD and the tax credit programs, we really need that origination capacity on the ground, and that is resourcing our communities to help with that. And then again, like I mentioned the introduction, I'm going to really start sounding like a broken record here, is we also need to you know, support the lending process with moving these buildings through upgrade. I think having those lending resources at the front end is important and getting them into that process, but we want to make sure that what comes out at the back end of that lending process is actually a really high quality building. Right.
Sylvia?
Yeah, I think just +1 definitely to what both Abby and Damon said. I think it's really important to provide funding for that capacity building in communities, and especially for community engagement. I think that's something that often does not get as much commitment as there needs to be to make sure that these investments really have the impact that we want. And I think, like, overall, like, in addition to that, there just needs to be a commitment from the funding and financing sources to communities and to equity in general, because I think otherwise I mean, the way the system works and the status quo is that everything will just kind of go to benefit the people who are already benefiting.
My father loves to say that they only want to give you a loan when you don't need one. It's the point of what you're saying. So Kathy, to you.
Well, we need to get your dad at a CDFI credit union then. Because yeah, I think, you know, just from the credit union, in the credit union world where our focus is a lot on consumer and household level financing, you know, it's critical to, it's essential that the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund gets down to community-based lenders as quickly, easily, and at lowest cost possible, because it's on the ground in community-based lending that we're going to be making sure we're doing that hard work of not just thinking about loan products. Lenders love to sit around a table and say, like, let's create a bunch of loan products. But if there's not people who can access those loan products and are not going to be successful in those loans, then it really doesn't matter. You've got, you know, all these wonderful ideas. And I think one of the things that a community-based lender has to contend with all the time is that engagement with their borrowers who are telling them, you know, I don't know if I'm going to be successful with this. And they're looking at how do you make it work? So I think that's going to be really important. The other thing we're thinking a lot about is how we have to really dig into some of the other supports in the IRA. And I think to Sylvia's point earlier in the presentation, kind of thinking through, we need to package subsidies and supports. We need to get those, you know, as much supports as we can to lower income, lower wealth households who are going to be, who need those subsidies to be able to be successful in the capital products. So it's not going to be easy. And there's a lot of challenges because the tax credits are not refundable and other issues. But I think the more that we can put our brainpower into sort of extending loan terms, into being really flexible around finding other sources of subsidy, we have to not just get the capital out, we have to have people be successful with the capital. And the only way we're going to do that is if with that energy cost burden reduction is somehow aligned with the loan repayments. So that's our challenge, but it's a good one.
It is, and I'm seeing a few questions coming in. So I'm going to do this one kind of whoever wants to be the first that Adam put in the chat. And I'm going to read it out, but I'm going to put out the first sort of hard part that they want to get the money out the door fast. They need to for good reasons so that it gets used for the right reasons. But that's in tension with trying to make it equity and community led. So that kind of the preface that those two things are in tension. Adam says a major vehicle for deploying these dollars will be nonprofit lenders like green banks, CDFIs, and credit unions, many of whom may not have deep knowledge or relationships with EJ organizations, environmental justice. What are some ways these lenders can work with an EJ organizations, and what can be gained both from the lender perspective and the EJ organization perspective? Who wants to go first? Come on, one of you.
I'll take it, or I'll go first. This is a great question. Thank you, Adam. And I would, I know there is this, you know, urgency to get money out the door quickly, but I would urge, you know, go slow to finish fast. And I think one way I think that lenders could really start, you know, learning more about their EJ communities is to start slow and, you know, get community input and do some, you know, kind of information sharing and education, because I think really understanding what the needs are is important, because, you know, they're probably different than maybe what you're thinking they are, you know, as a lender. So I think really starting slow and getting that input at the front end and kind of building those relationships. I don't think there's any substitute for doing that. And I think the products that'll come out will be better and, you know, and serve the community. And because they're more aligned, they'll the money will actually get out the door quicker.
And just to give one piece of information for folks that aren't as in the weeds, the legislation requires the money to be allocated from EPA by next September. That doesn't mean it's actually into projects yet in all sorts of situations, in most of the situations, but just that's part of the speed of trying to get the money out the door by that deadline. Is there anyone else that wants to build on Abby's great answer?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, I'll echo Abby's great answer, and I'll just say, I do think it's these are relationships that we need to be forging with a lot of intentionality, and on the ground, I think in some communities, they're already happening naturally, and a lot of stakeholders already know each other. But I think in order for the community-based lenders to be as responsive as possible, they really do need to kind of have ongoing inputs and ongoing dialogue around what is most needed in the community, how they should be thinking about structuring, whether it's loan terms, whether it's, if it's the length of lending, if there's the specific details around, around community priorities, and being able to really kind of, understand that. And I will say the one challenge often is particularly, where you have these community-based lenders where, they're also operating sometimes a full service financial institution. And so being able to have some space and some resources that enable them to kind of cover the costs of the time involved to really be engaging with local leaders in their community is going to be really important. I am hoping that that's the accelerator is going to create the opportunity for some grant funding for both environmental justice groups and as well as community-based lenders to kind of take the time and forge those relationships and put those plans together. And hopefully we'll see in the final NOFO that kind of work is actually going to be encouraged through sources of support.
And just one follow-up, you said accelerator, but I think you mean Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, right? Because it changed names.
Yeah, I meant the community, the CCIA part.
Oh, okay, that version. That's what I just wanted to clarify.
That accelerator, yeah.
Because it did. It started out as the Green Bank Act, then the Climate Bank Act,
Yes.
the accelerator, and then the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So making sure I knew which one everyone's talking about.
Yes, and now within the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, we have a small offshoot that is the not so small.
Perfect. And no pressure if others want to chime in, or we can go to next questions. I'm seeing no unmuting. So there was a specific question for you, Damon, about a very compelling platform. Thank you. More resilient neighborhoods create positive impacts. How do you measure the community wealth, and what kind of mechanisms can you talk about around reinvestment?
I think there are a variety of ways to measure community wealth. When I mentioned it as a part of our plan, we're specifically talking about our net assets, because our net assets is what will be judged on by the community, as well as by investors, by the rating agencies, et cetera. So our public wealth is always being evaluated, and it's a measure of how much financing we can bring back to our community. So the more capital we have on our balance sheet, the more opportunity that opens up for single family home ownership, for multifamily development, et cetera. So that's one way of measuring it, but also a way of measuring it is calculating how much of that worth we're actually transferring to the community. How many homeowners did we create? How many developers are we helping access the municipal bond market? For example, we've had a very specific focus on helping BIPOC developers access the tax-exempt bond market, which is very difficult to do. So that creates direct wealth for that developer if we can help them rinse, wash, and repeat several times. Because one time won't do it. So it's got to be a continuous process and an open platform that allows not just us to grow the wealth that we have internally and that we're trying to use for public reinvestment, but also helping the community develop their wealth as well through home ownership, development, or entrepreneurship, whatever the case might be.
Well, great. I'm going to pause and see if anyone's got a hand up. Anyone want to ask a question, including Justin? I'm happy to ask your question from the chat, but if you want to do it, feel free to come off mute. Not seeing it happen quickly. I'll keep moving, but y'all use the hand raise function because I know people are tired of hearing me ask questions. What are some of the best practices or key points that resonate with communities when educating them about environmental justice and the gaps in energy burdens? Sylvia, I'm guessing this might be a question that you'd be up for answering.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would start off with is just saying that in my experience, you don't necessarily need to educate the communities about this. They are already the experts on it. They can tell you about how hard it is to keep up with paying these like escalating energy bills and the health effects that they and their neighbors and other community members are experiencing because of the pollution burden. So I really encourage everyone to think of like the residents in environmental justice communities as the experts, and they are the ones who should be providing the education to the other folks in the ecosystem. I mean, in terms of like how to kind of like, I think what they can use from folks on this call is like how to connect the dots in the whole complicated finance system. Like I don't come from a finance background. I find it very confusing, and I've been working and learning about it for the past several years, but I think that's really what a lot of people can use more support on.
Did anyone want to answer? Because I also want to +1 that I do some work in finance, and I also find it confusing. And I feel empowered to ask the questions, et cetera. And I have like all sorts of connections and I still struggle. So absolutely the idea that you're putting out the information on how to use the tools rather than, what the issues are. Well, great. I so appreciate, Ella, you being the first person to raise your hand. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a question for Damon on something you spoke about of bringing other commercial banks or institutions that aren't doing your business model as their standard practice, but bringing them to the table and sharing your practices, or they come to you about it. I just wondered what your process is for that when talking to commercial banks that maybe aren't familiar, but maybe, for example, receiving some of these funds and having to start implement work that they're not used to doing.
Sure, Ella, great question. And that could look a number of ways. One way that we've done it is through our single family program. I mentioned that's been around for 40 years. Well, a big part of that program is a partnership with community lenders. So we depend on local banks. And at one point it was mortgage brokers, but now it's mainly just banks. We depend on them to originate our mortgages. So they have to be bought in as much as we are, because if not, they're not going to market our product to the community in the most effective way that they should. So when we started changing our programming to accommodate climate resilience, we went from just a traditional mortgage to a green mortgage program. Well, you had a few lenders that stood up and said, I'm not comfortable with this process, because now this means I have to monitor solar panel installation or battery storage installation, or a contractor has to go out and put on a new roof, or they're trying to seal the envelope of a home. Whatever the home needs, or whatever the developer or individual decides they need with that home, the bank is going to be intimately involved in that process. So the bank, number one, has to be committed to investing the resources and time and process into addressing climate resilience, or just updating the built environment overall. Because if they don't, then they're going to shy away from the product, and they're going to sit on the sideline and not necessarily try to stop it, but they're going to stand up and say, you know what, we don't understand this. Or there's been a situation where we went to a convention conference and brought some bankers with us from a local bank. because we said we want to start doing commercial building retrofits, green retrofits of multifamily, office space, institutional buildings, municipal buildings. So we went to learn and we asked the banks to join. Well, the bankers came, they loved it, asked a lot of questions, but when they got back home, they couldn't do anything about it because it was against the politics of their bank, meaning against the politics of the customers of that bank. So they didn't want to do anything to upset their customer base. So they said, you know what, we're just going to stay away from anything green solar for a while. Now, this was a few years ago before COVID. So I think over time, people's habits will change and different banks will be on different pages. So just like we have some banks that shy away, there are also some banks that come closer to us. And they've started to be creative about products that we want to offer. And they've been giving us ideas on how to better offer that product. So there are some good partnerships out there, and we're just focused on those for now. And it's like anything else. If you were building a startup company or a private sector product, you're going to have early adopters or you're going to have late adopters. And I think some of those banks are early adopters, and we're just trying to focus our energy with them so we can figure it out, and then we'll expand to the late adopters later on.
Thank you. That helps a lot.
You're welcome.
Not seeing other hands, but hopefully we'll get a few more. I'm going to ask a super selfish question as the person that's trying to help bring all these pieces together in a way that we can do it. And knowing all the different participants on this call have a lot of abilities. What are the major gaps you're still seeing? What are the things that some places will come straight from the greenhouse gas reduction fund. There might be some TA, there's like things like that we know are gaps, but we might have better. After we see the no flow, we'll know the answer, but we have a sense that could be covered. But what are some of the gaps you see remaining that you need others in the ecosystem to be helping to fill in?
I have a few comments to that. So number one, at least from the public finance side, we've been having a lot of conversations with philanthropy and non-traditional municipal investors about how they get involved in the public finance market. That's where a lot of this infrastructure will be financed. So I think there's a gap in terms of the understanding of that new money to the muni market and where they fit in. So there's some good actors out there that are trying to figure it out. So I would say I would encourage any participants on the phone, investors, maybe a bank that hasn't engaged in that aspect yet to invest in that part of it. I would also say that, and this is thinking longer term, not so much an immediate gap, but the $27 billion that's available through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and I know there's some other public dollars that are out there, it's not enough to solve the full problem of resilience. I think we all know that. So we need to be thinking long term about how do we solve that bigger gap, which is how do we get to the 15 trillion of investment that the US needs in the next 20 or 30 years, where only 400 billion a year is coming through the municipal bond market. So there's a big gap in terms of what we're doing and versus what we need, but there's also a need for new types of money, new types of capital to come to the market. So just innovation overall, as it relates to sustainable finance, how that looks versus the traditional finance system that we've had. I think we just have to go through a complete shift and be open to new types of sources of money, new types of ways of building projects, and new types of partnerships. It's not just public-private, it's really public-private philanthropic. And those are the relationships that are going to be needed to really solve the long-term gap.
I'll also just add to that. I think we are seeing gaps in the clean energy economy that very much mirror capital gaps we've always seen when trying to serve low-income communities and other communities that have historically been excluded from the financial system. We're finding it challenging to build a sufficient base of contractors and solar installers that work in communities of color, that have cultural competencies, that have a focus on kind of really and recognize and understand a marketplace. We work in concert with our partner, Inclusive Prosperity Capital, and on their Smart E loan platform, which is a brilliant platform that matches up community lenders with contractors to be able to provide sort of safe and responsible products and services paired up with responsible contractors. And in each place that at each new location that we're trying to bring that out, we're organizing the lending community, mostly CDFIs and community credit unions are stepping in and building the products that are affordable and long enough term with low enough monthly repayments, monthly payments to enable folks to be able to plug in. But we're having a challenging time with the kind of formal, solar installer community. And I think there's a lot of opportunity with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to be, I think, as several of the panelists have pointed out, we need to really be focusing capital on minority and women-owned businesses that are going to be able to grow and scale their businesses to fill in that gap and to be providing those solutions. I think that's going to be, I hope to see one of the greatest things that we can be addressing, one of the biggest gaps we can be addressing with the fund right away.
I'm just going to say, Kathy from Inclusive Prosperity Capital was in the chat, completely agreeing with you. Building the contractor capacity that works and comes from EJ communities. It's a big challenge. We see this all across the country. So we have a lot of people that are all doing amazing work that are agreeing in this space. And Abby, I think I'd seen you also and Sylvia come off mute. Does that mean that y'all want to also chime in, please?
Yeah, just really quickly. I think around this table, we've talked about policy in general, but I think we do need enabling policy, to bring more buildings into these processes, and that's kind of goes to the origination side. But I think we also need enabling state policy to move community solar, and that means bringing our utility partners along, because often where we get stuck as an implementer is really at the utility level. So we really need that policy environment, at the state level, kind of to support these type of projects moving forward.
Yeah, that was exactly the point that I was going to make. But I also just want to add another +1 to Kathy's point about the minority and women-owned businesses and cultural competency, because and cultural competency as well as language access is I think really critical. I think a lot of these communities, a big barrier is going to be trust, and so having folks who can speak in the same language, have the same cultural background, is one way to help build that trust.
We've definitely seen that in different examples through the years as well. So I 100% want to agree, especially with things that are newer and scarier, be it the financing scarier or the technology scarier. So the more connected you are on those pieces, then that makes a lot of sense. Well, I want to say my one complaint is there's been no disagreeing. Everyone seems to agree of our panels, which is mostly great, but I feel like we need a little bit of spice. I don't think we'll get it here, but we have a question. How feasible is the idea of one-stop shop so that customers don't get overwhelmed with a transition to clean energy?
I have a thought there, Sarah. One-stop shop sounds great, and we've tried to do it in many cases. I think it's difficult though for one group to take on all of it. Going back to what the theme of all of the partnerships, public, private, philanthropic, they're just different roles that need to be satisfied. So I do think there's leadership needed, and maybe there can be a leader of the movement. But in terms of executing the work that has to be done, it's just very difficult to put that all under one roof. I just saw a comment in the chat about utilities being important. They have to be at the table. City government has to be at the table, state government, corporations, large corporates, the startup community has to be at the table. So there's just so many different moving parts to it. It's just really hard to put it all under one roof, but certainly it can be centralized with leadership from public, private, and philanthropic organizations.
I don't think we're disagreeing, but this might be our point of disagreement. I agree, Damon, they are hard. They are hard to put together. They take resources and really dedicated resources, but kind of as a organization that, you know, implements one-stop shops, we are a huge proponent of them because we feel like, especially for, either less well-resourced communities or building owners, that they do provide a central, you know, kind of organizing spot where they can go for everything and not have to figure it out for themselves. So I think, yes, they are hard, but I think if we look at it at the local level, resource it locally, and make sure that we have the right local partners at the table, I think it's totally possible.
I also saw call the attention. There's a version of all being in one place and a lot more being in one place too. So I think we can at least try to hit for the like way more coordinated, but it is true when you're talking about public-private partnerships and philanthropy, et cetera, there are lots of moving pieces too. So, but the more that we can bring it together, it sounds like most people agree that that would be really helpful. And also everything's changing fast. That's the other part that makes this a really hard one too. It's not like you set something up and exemplified by how many things are out for comment from the IRA and from regulations right now, and all of that's changing really quickly too.
I kind of, I mean, when it comes to the consumer and household space, I like to think about like entry points. And I think a lot about, we need to be helping our financial counselor and coaching, organizations around the country to be a lot more connected to the different opportunities that are available through the IRA, and being able to know how to connect individuals and households to those opportunities. I do sometimes worry, I mean, maybe it's having lived through the subprime lending years where one-stop shops were equal to, predatory practices and driving people into, products that weren't always, that were certainly not to their benefit. And obviously we're not talking about that when we're thinking about the nonprofit sector, but always trying to think about, maximizing consumer choice is really also an important balance point there. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and in the consumer and household space, there's a lot of opportunities to be thinking about getting sort of folks, a lot of social service organizations, a lot of housing organizations, a lot of financial coaches and counselors really well educated on opportunities, but then helping people find appropriate choice that makes sense for where they are and what they need.
Well, no one's raising their hand, but they're putting great questions in. So if no one wants to ask them themselves, I'll keep doing as I'm doing and reading them out. How do panelists believe the tension between the requirement for market transformation and the requirement for commercially available project technology activity will be addressed by the EPA? So if you want to read it, it's then in there.
I have the same question. Well, I think with EPA, it sounds like they're trying to get organized and trying to understand the greenhouse gas reduction fund themselves. So I think there's a learning curve that they're going to go through. But certainly this is really about technology. And that's one of the early premises. I see some of the other green banks on the line. And that's something we talk about all the time as a collective, is that this is really a technology play. Because in order for something to become green or sustainable, there's some new aspect that's being added, and that has to be financed as a part of it. So the challenge there is, as a community advocate, the community depends on us to protect them and only bring good opportunities. Well, we got to vet out the different technologies that work, the ones that don't work, and we want to try them all, and it's exciting, but the reality is there needs to be some kind of buffer. So I think the role that the EPA could play as the public sector partner at the federal level is making sure there's a continuous stream of capital flowing into the innovation that's needed for the built environment, and making sure that those technologies get developed, that they're maturing along the way, that we get through this process of becoming sustainable. They're not all going to work right away, but there needs to be a continuous stream of investment going into it. So I don't know that it's laid out in that exact way just yet. I'm still learning myself. Maybe some of the other panelists have different insights on it.
And I'll jump in for a quick piece of that. I agree that also the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund doesn't solve all the problems. It's focused a little bit, so that's a piece of it. It's to what you were describing, Damon, that there are other parts of the government, et cetera, that need to be stepping up for different pieces, I think is part of the answer. But I'm eager to hear other panelists' perspective if anyone wants to chime in. The one thing that's hard is everyone knows so much, so it's not like any one question is usually for anyone. Well, great. I saw another question that I just went away from that. Do you think the accumulation of debt could be a deterrent to low-income home buyers or multifamily resident portfolios who've already accrued debt? How do you mitigate this, ensure that costs aren't transferred to residents? This talk goes into that predatory piece. And even if it isn't predatory, if people worry it's predatory, and trying to deal with that. And I see you, Kathy, nodding. So do you want to stop and jump in?
Yeah, I mean, that's the critical question. And it is, there's a couple of different ways to sort of think about it. And I think in certain marketplaces, we can successfully be matching up the fact that, yes, you're taking on debt, but if your repayment is offset sufficiently enough from the reduction in your energy costs, then we're sort of hitting the right point. You're increasing the value, you're investing in your home, you're increasing its value, you're being able to offset the cost of that debt by reducing the cost of your energy. But as was pointed out earlier, I mean, the utility companies vary from place to place. They change in the middle of a loan. So, when we think sometimes about being really flexible in our financing, we're like, okay, let's take this solar loan and take it from a 7-year loan to a 20-year loan. So that monthly repayment is a lot lower. Well, and now we can match it to what you're getting back or what you're going to be saving on your utility bill. 2 years in, the utility company changes the terms. That household is bearing that risk. So we do have there's a lot of variables. There's a lot of risks that we have to figure out. How do we kind of use some of these resources, whether it's through creating like reserve funds that deal with those kinds of contingencies or insurance pools that will offset that. We're going to have to get more and more sophisticated to make sure that people are successful with these. At the end of the day, we need to make sure that people are better off, more financially stable, and strengthened by this intervention than not. So it's going to be an ongoing challenge for a long time to come until we have some kind of consistent policy around utilities across the board.
And just to and this will probably connect very much so with Damon in particular for New Orleans, resilience is a piece of that too. If you make your house perfectly energy efficient, but it's in a flood prone area, you don't consider that, that's definitely a version where you won't be making someone's life better off because now they have to pay for insulation that you have to replace because it got washed out.
Just a few more points on. Oh, go ahead, Abigail. Go ahead.
No, you can go ahead, Damon.
Yeah, I was just going to throw out a few things about what we're learning about single family and multifamily. It is becoming cost prohibitive for a family to add some of those interventions. We put them in 3 buckets: energy, wind, and water. So what Sarah's talking about as it relates to the resilience, the homeowner can choose from those 3 different categories. A developer can as well. Now we have some minimum standards in the city, enterprise green communities, some stormwater management requirements. But at the end of the day, the cost of housing, the cost of living is just so high that everything is marginal. So the decision to add some of these features, energy, wind, or water, is a marginal decision. And homeowners and developers likewise are looking at it saying, I don't know if it's enough to really push me over the edge to really make that investment. So I think a couple of things need to happen. Kathy, the model that you talked about, where you're looking at the savings and creating more operational efficiencies, that's one approach. I think the cities, if they want to see these kind of things happen, will have to start putting equity into these programs. What I mean by that is policy, going back to public policy. How is the city using their general obligations bond dollars? How is it using some of their other tax dollars that are being leveraged into project financing, and typically goes to a traditional style of infrastructure? But what does that conversion look like to a more sustainable style of infrastructure, housing included? So there's just going to be subsidy outright. And I saw another question about what do we do now before the greenhouse gas dollars come? Cities got to put up equity. And you got to, I think, taking some small projects one at a time. That's what we're trying to do. Let's figure that out. But the city's got to put equity in these things to make it work, because it's going to require a lot of free money, a lot of subsidy alongside debt and equity and other types of financial mechanisms, tax credits. It's going to take that type of capital stack in order for it to work in these very early years.
I totally agree with that. There is going to have to be lots of subsidy here. First money in should always be the free money for sure. I just want to make a comment on kind of the tying, the debt to energy savings. I think that as this is developing, there may be other kind of processes to consider, in the lending process, not just at the beginning and the underwriting stage, but, checking in to make sure, okay, how are the energy bills going? Are they higher? Are they, kind of what we would expect, so that we are not in a situation where we're increasing energy burden? Because I think, to Kathy's comment, utility rates change, things change, but, also not every installation, especially around decarbonization, is going to result in energy savings in every building. So we want to really be cognizant of having some check-in points to make sure that we're not doing more harm than we are good with these processes.
Here's a kind of specific question that I'm guessing, Kathy, you'd be the best. To what extent is the CDFI recertification design being done by the CDFI fund take into account the green element? And how can we advocate for environmental justice in that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for those, those CDFIs and others on the line, the fund is going through a major overhaul of their certification application and processes. And in the version that was released and heavily commented on in the fall, it did not address green lending really at all. And I think there's gonna, I don't know to what extent that they're bringing it on, but I think it's a great point that we probably should be using the fact that there is a pause in the process, because there were so many comments about the certification process and such a concern that the fund really needed to take a little bit more time to work through it. This might be a great moment for us to raise it. I also understand that Michael Swack chairs the subcommittee at the CDFI Fund Advisory Board that is looking and will be providing some input from the community to the fund on the certification process. So it might be a good thing for us to take from this call is to sort of think about what we would advise from the fund. I think one thing that's going to be important is, a lot of the CDFI certification is about your sort of designation of target markets. And when you're moving to new opportunities, like trying to grow into, something like this that comes along, a lot of times it takes you need to let your lending kind of go. And in order to respond to the new needs in the marketplace, and you don't always have the time to sort of go back and cross tab and make sure it fits with your application that might have been submitted, 12 to 14 months prior. So I do think that there's probably going to need to be some kind, we could maybe think about asking the fund to create some kind of opportunity for around the green lending space to allow CDFIs maybe to do some innovation that wouldn't count towards their certification for like the first year, first 1 to 3 years, so that we can be testing out and responding to new opportunities that are coming and not just, feeling stuck to requirements of the fund. So that's one thing off the top of my head. I'm sure others on the call probably have many other ideas as well.
Well, we're getting towards the end, so I'm actually thinking that the perfect way, someone referenced Tina, who is our co-organizer for this event, having asked this question. So I think we could each do a little bit of responding to this question that I'll read, as well as just any of your closing thoughts. And I'll go in the order on my screen and call y'all out. But the question was, it's going to be a while before the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund dollars hit the streets. What can CDFIs, CDCUs, and other lenders do now to get ready and start addressing these clear equity issues and clean green opportunities? So that, plus any closing thoughts that you wanted to have. So give yourself a few minutes, and I'll start with you, Sylvia. You're next on my screen.
Yeah, I'm trying not to be a broken record, but I think the problem of like creating trust and building relationships with the communities you're trying to serve is not trivial and like really takes a lot of time and work. So I think that is number one. And as part of that, I would include putting in the resources for capacity building for the community-based organizations that work in these communities. And then also as a plug for my closing thoughts, I just want to again bring up this GGRF awardee best practices that I mentioned, and we're looking for organizational endorsers. You can sign on there, and again, there's a link to the full document from that form as well.
Extremely important work. Thanks for helping to organize. Because it's true, we've got to do some, that goes also to the question part. You've got to do some of this pre-organizing about what are the things we agree to before the money hits the street, so that way we have some good principles that we all can follow. Wonderful. Abby, you're next.
Great. And yeah, I want to just echo everything Sylvia just said. I think aligning partners, starting that process. Start talking to the municipality in your service territories, start talking to the utilities, really just start kind of that partner, building that partner network. I would add, maybe start assessing systems and processes. It's something we're doing on our end to really understand, potentially what has to change to accommodate, this kind of scale and type of program, and really prepare to resource, community-based organizations and kind of on the ground. With on the ground capacity building. And I'm also going to just say one more thing is like, hopefully we get more guidance on the rebates and incentives, because I think we all have to have a really good understanding of the incentives, the rebates, and the tax credits, and how these flow into all the projects that are like we're going to be working on, from an implementation standpoint, but that are going to require financing. Our early assessment of those rebates and tax credits, show that there's still going to be a financing gap in many of these projects. Thanks, Sarah.
Damon.
First thing that comes to mind is community engagement, and you can't do enough of it. It's already been said. So I think community engagement is the starting point, but it's also the checkpoint. So as other things are developed, like a formal plan, which I highly recommend if a city does not have it, and I know cities have no shortage of plans and studies and research documents. However, for this particular scenario, what we're trying to accomplish in the city, we had to articulate it in a plan, or else people wouldn't really listen to us. And we couldn't get very far in our meetings because we didn't have an official plan. So we had to go out and develop that. And that's helped open a lot of doors for sure and keep everybody engaged. I'll say also start building a pipeline of projects based on that plan. So what does that community call for? What are the top environmental needs? What are the economic development needs, social equity needs? Outline those things in the plan and build a pipeline around that, and then start building the infrastructure for the entity, the collaboration, whatever it's going to be that carries out that plan. Start building that infrastructure around those pipeline projects. So that's about all you can do without the money. And I think getting the cities to invest equity into these projects to help jumpstart them is also very critical. Philanthropy has been interested in playing that role. So I would say the real important thing is to just have the community at the table, build the projects, get a plan, and start executing on that early pipeline.
Absolutely. Kathy.
And I'll just say +1 on all that the panelists have identified, and particularly double +1 on that community engagement piece, because that's really, I think, where so much of the work on what's going to be needed has to happen. But also just put in yet another plug for the lenders on this webinar who are interested in getting better kind of prepared. I definitely encourage you to reach out to the University of New Hampshire Carsey School, who's putting on this webinar series along with NRDC, and find out about the Solar Finance Training Program. There's a great Solar Finance Training Program 101 that is self-paced. It's available to anybody. It's all free of charge. And you can it'll give you a sense of a lot of different examples of the way in which you could be thinking about. I don't really think about it as designing new products. I think about it as putting a climate lens on the products and services you're already delivering. And then if you're really motivated to go forward, there's the consumer and the commercial track. And really, it's like a 6 to 8 week program where you're walking through each of these steps with a peer group that's walking through it with you. So you're going through your market analysis, you're reaching out and thinking and forging partnerships and gathering information from local partners. And through that process, you're really kind of designing appropriate, loan products and programs that make sense in your community. So think about that.
Yes, and just to echo what everyone's saying, but in somewhat different way, I think the word trust came up a lot, and it should. I think building things earlier and trying to really build relationships makes a lot of sense in all sorts of versions of it. The infrastructure version of it, like who your partners are going to be, the education, all of that piece. As well as using the resources that are out there to start understanding what's happening. You were mentioning specific ones that Carsey has. There are others, these different guides that were on the website, and I think are also in the chat already. There's a lot of that like generalized education that can begin now. And the notice of funding is probably coming out in the next week. So there's a piece of that we will all have probably different answers to what to do next as soon as there's more concrete materials out there. So I put all of my answers, and I think everyone's are a little bit in the, until then, these are the things you can do. And then once those are out, I have a feeling there'll be a lot more so come and listen to the next webinars in this series, and they'll probably start to be more and more concrete things that everyone will be able to do. So thank you so much to all the panelists. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tina.
Great. Thank you all so very much for this wonderful 90 minutes of both challenge and inspiration. So plug for the webinar series. Don't just come and learn, come and challenge and add to the conversation. These strategy guides that we've put together with input from a lot of you, and thank you for the input you've already given. We really see those as just the beginning of the conversation, and we really want to build on that body of work such that we can foster the very best practices and incentivize and enable collaborations. And so come help us do that work, and we will reflect it back out to the rest of this community of practice. And thank you for everything you do. Sarah, thank you for wonderful moderating. Damon, Sylvia, Abby, Kathy, thank you for everything today and everything you do. Full stop. Appreciate everyone being on the call and hope to see you next Thursday.